plague is always in the background of the Canterbury Tales. It's very rarely referenced, and usually only very obliquely, but it is there. It was, after all, 48 was, Chaucer was just a child then, but the Black Plague recurred throughout Europe and England for decades afterwards. So this really colored his lifetime. And the most explicit reference we get to it comes in the Pardoner's Tale. The Pardoner is famously the seller of indulgences who comes in for some abuse in the general prologue. He is a more colorful character for how vicious he is and how vile he is in many ways. And in fact, Chaucer, in the introduction, goes out of his way to paint him in particularly sexual terms of being effeminate, or perhaps even hermaphroditic. The most famous line of that is Chaucer, the narrator, was uncertain whether he was whether the Pardoner was a gelding or a mare. He references his high voice, his long hair. He's very skinny, and somewhat effeminate in his mannerism, supposedly. This characterization complicates the story in a number of different ways, in the ways that he becomes a grotesque figure. But when he gets an opportunity to tell his tale, it's really quite remarkable. He gives a defense, essentially, of his, in his prologue, he gives a defense of his method of making a living. And he goes through a perfectly frank admission that, yeah, I steal from people. I take advantage of them. He says, I tell them, common people, exempla that I know, which is, again, ding, 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 a reference to storytelling. Exempla are simple stories that need to be interpreted. They're a common aspect of sermons. You tell a story to make a point, and here he is telling, this is Chaucer telling the reader, perhaps, that stories, no matter how simple, should be interpreted. You need to bring some thought to the process. Just judging it on the surface is complicated. But the Pardoner goes and says, of the villagers, money and wool, cheese and wheat I will get, although by the poorest page they're given, or the village's poorest widow then, even if her children died from hunger, no, from the vine I will drink the liquor, and have a jolly wench in every town. He's celebrating the fact that he is so vile, that he takes such advantage of people. But he begins his tale, and he starts with a long catalog of sins and how these are just terrible things. And they are all, he spends an awful lot of time on gluttony, he spends an awful lot of time on gambling, and he spends no time at all on sexual sins, which is curious. But he strikes up this story of these three friends, these three dissolute young men who gamble and drink and lay around and do all the stuff that he had been condemning in the beginning. And they make mention, explicit mention, to there came a secret thief called Death, men say, who in this country all the people slay. In two he smote his heart, and then with his spear, and went away with no more words from here. He's slain 1,000 in this pestilence. Master, before you come in his presence, it seems to me that it's necessary to be wary of this adversary. Adversary is a very loaded term also, because it's a euphemism, or it's a particular moniker for Satan. From the biblical tradition, but it is it's an explicit personification of death, and specifically death from pestilence, from contagion from the plague. And here this is sort of haunting it. And these three young men decide that they are going to go and defeat death. And they go out hunting, and they pledge their honor to one another that we will be together until, until the end of time. Blah, 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 blah. Code of honor. Honor among thieves. They go and they run across this old man on the road who, and they ask him, what's with you? Can you help us find death? This character who is haunting the countryside. And he says, no, I can't. I'm an old man. I would love to, but it won't take me. For as long a time as it is God's will, alas, does not want to have my life. Death has no logic. He's an old man. He wants to die. He can't. They make specific reference to, lo, how I vanish, flesh and blood and skin, which seems oddly medical, almost like leprosy, or honestly skin conditions that that come with the plague. It says, and thus all pale and withered is my face. Again, you get a sense of somebody who's really being ravaged by some virus. So he says, well, if you go over there, there's a tree, and underneath that tree, you will find death. If that's what you want, go for it. Significantly, he says, right there, him you will find. May God save you who bought again mankind. May God save you. You can find your own death. Death comes from you. God may save you, but you don't know. So they go and they find this tree, and they look underneath it, and they find money. They find gold. They find a huge treasure there, and they go, wow, we were looking for death, but this is much better. These aren't necessarily big crusaders who are out there to save mankind. They're crooks and they're layabouts. So, finding money is better. But they immediately realize it's too much to carry back. They decide that of the three of them, they will send one back to town to help get some stuff that they can transport it. And they send the young one back. And once he is gone, the other two sit there and they strike a little deal. And they say, well, here is gold, and that in quite some plenty, which shall divided be among us three. But nonetheless, if I can shape it so, it's divided between us two, So they decide, well, the divided by 3 is great. Divided by 2 would be more for us. So we got to get rid of that other guy. And they come up with this plan that when the other guy comes back, they're going to be pretending to be wrestling, and in the fracas, one of them will reach out and stab the young guy, and then the other one will pull out a knife and stab the young guy once he's wounded, and he will die, and they will get all of the money. And they swear that, okay, now it's just going to be the two of us, but I give you my word that you can trust me. Well, you gave your word to the younger one. How much is your word really worth? Meanwhile, the young one had gone into town, and he starts thinking, well, yeah, divided by 3 is great, but you know what? Having it all to myself would be better. So he goes to an apothecary, basically a druggist, and he says, make me some poison. I have some rats on my farm. I want to get rid of them. I need something really powerful. So he buys some poison. He takes it and pours it into bottles of water. He has 3 bottles of water. He marks his off on the side, which is just fresh, clean water, but then he pours a whole bunch of poison in the other 2. And he goes back. His friends, in fact, jump him, stab him, kill him, and then in the end, They say, let us sink, let us sit and drink, and now be merry. Afterwards we will his body bury. So of course, maybe they worked up a little bit of a sweat in the wrestling, and then killing the guy. Hey, it's Miller time. Let's just pop a cold one. And they refresh themselves, which of course has poison, and they immediately die. They drank and gave the drink to his fellow two, and thus at once they died, both of these two. Boom, gone, goodbye. Now, of course, in this you can see very clearly that death does not come from God. They went looking for death in a person, and they came from the death within human nature. It is human personalities, human drives, human nature itself that brings death. Maybe God will get involved. May God save you. Maybe he won't. There's no logic to it. There's no predictability to it. There's maybe no order to it, no reason to it. You can only save yourself. Now, specifically, think what this means for the partner. The partner is out there trying to convince people that, well, if you give him money, he can get them out of a little purgatory. He can salvage their soul and forgive their sins if they just give him a little money, and he'll get the word from the Pope. Sure. So he has a lot invested in this system of belief in a logical world, but it's very ambivalent how much he personally believes in it. Now, he clearly has a very jaundiced eye towards his victims, towards the common people who give him his money, and he seems to have very little remorse necessarily about that. Figuring, caveat emptor, the buyer beware. They're buying peace of mind, if nothing else. All right, what can I do? But towards the end of his tale, he seems to just slip just a little bit in talking about this, and he goes off on another rant about sin in general. "O cursed sin of all cursedness, O homicidal traitors, O wickedness, O gluttony, O gambling and lechery, you blasphemer of Christ with villainy and great oaths, through habit and through pride, alas, mankind, how may it be denied that to your Creator, who has you wrought, and with his precious heart's blood has you bought, against nature, you're false and unkind, alas." He rails against human propensities for sin. He rails against sin itself. He rails against how can sinners not recognize or not appreciate the sacrifice of God, or the sacrifice of Christ, and what that means, which is a weird little tone to suddenly, he recognizes, or he admits that Christ has, maybe Christ deserves better. Maybe humanity isn't living up to its end of the bargain. Maybe he himself, as a sinner, as a vicious parasite on humanity and the whole notion of faith, maybe he is culpable. And he says down towards the end of this, "Lo, sires, I thus preach then, now Jesus Christ, who is our soul's physician, grant to you his pardon to receive." So he's saying, may Jesus pardon you. May you be forgiven. For that is best. I will you not deceive. So he's admitting that, I'm kind of a fraud. He's admitting that, okay, what I do, I don't know so much, and Christ is really the only avenue towards that forgiveness, and you can't necessarily take it from me. There is this, it has been called a sudden paroxysm, I think, of sincerity, a shock of sincerity, that after all of this sturm and drang about sin and how horrible it all is, he just sort of recognizes, almost by preaching to himself, like he himself is starting to interpret the exemplum that he has laid out. He himself is recognizing that, well, yeah, I'm part of the problem. Now the story itself comes in for a little bit more of a shock at the end, as the host, who is never afraid to launch in and start, what are you doing? That's disgusting. You're telling me you're an awful person. And he starts weighing in, and he goes at him in a particularly vulgar way. He asked, he insinuates, because they're talking about the relics that this that the pardoner goes and sells. These holy relics, often he's said that he has, like, wood chips and bits of pig's bones that he sells as pieces of the true cross, and the skeletons and remains of great saints. And this was a common thing back in this era, when people would want to have a piece of the true cross because it would have some divine value. But in a piece of this, he mocks the idea of what these things are, what they really are. And the host says, you would make me kiss your old underwear and swear it was the relic of a saint, though on it with your asshole you did paint. So he's saying, this is disgusting. This is gross. Now, first of all, the notion of it hasn't been lost on some critics that they are specifically mentioning his, let's just say, his anus, and there is that return to the kind of sexual deviancy of the character, and how that itself makes everything he says quite suspect. And it is an example of othering. That everything about you is corrupt because you are sexually bizarre. But it's almost as if in this moment, when he is exposing some of the most vile aspects of humanity, that he needs to be rejected. He is also significantly the only one that really brings up the plague in a more explicit way. So he must be rejected. He's getting too close to the bone. He is getting, all right, we're all telling stories, and some of them are exposing some, colorful aspects of humanity and some really nasty aspects of humanity. But there is something especially horrid about the pardoner that needs to be dismissed, that needs to be pushed back. And it is, in fact, the knight, the symbol of propriety, the symbol of, well, he is everything that is good and just, and a kind of social stability that he represents. He jumps in and he basically breaks up the fracas, because the host and the pardoner are starting to get kind of heated in their argument. So he comes in and he says, no, let's calm down. It is his role as the arbiter of social stability to come in and say, let's not get carried away. This needs to be calm. So polite society comes in and shuts down that line of conversation where it's going, because it is getting kind of ugly and kind of vicious, and it is exposing some of the worst things in life at that time. The practice of the sale of the indulgences, the preying on the poor, the complicity of the church itself, but also, again, that specter of death that they're all trying to get away from. Remember, they are going on a religious pilgrimage, and this is very common, but they're getting out of the city. The city with its crowds, with its lax sanitation methods, with its sheer vulnerability on every level to contagion. They are escaping the city and trying to escape mentally through the power of stories. They're trying to put the Black Death behind them with every step they take, with every story they tell. They're trying to get away. But when it pokes in, when it bubbles up, it gets particularly ugly. It's fascinating to watch that dynamic play around just under the skin as an exemplar, perhaps. The story itself is an exemplar. The Canterbury Tales is an exemplar. But we need to, as he reminds us, look beneath, peer in, poke in, and see what we can find that has meaning, that has significance, that maybe is an element of truth beneath all the occlusions of a vastly complicated world.